Motorcycle News Roundup. A quiet midweight from Honda has done more than earn headlines. It's redrawn the cruiser playbook. Instead of hype and chrome, the Rebel 500 arrived with timing, pricing, and usability that exposed Harley's soft spots in entry-level riders, global markets, and dealer momentum. Today we're unpacking how one bike, without noise, created a market shift you can feel on showroom floors. The quiet release that hit the bullseye. It didn't come with roaring fanfare or an overproduced unveil at a global motorcycle expo. There were no cryptic countdowns, no flashy ad campaigns, and no chrome-draped promises of tradition. Instead, Honda slipped the Rebel 500 into showrooms with surgical precision. A move so understated it almost looked accidental until you looked at the timing. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just another mid-size cruiser. It was a strategic strike. For years, Harley-Davidson had struggled with its entry-level space. The failure of the Street Series had left a gaping wound where younger riders, women, and commuters should have been brought into the Harley fold. Instead, those groups were ignored or pushed into bikes that felt like half measures, watered-down versions of Harley's bigger machines. Prices stayed high, identity stayed murky, and cultural relevance slipped further with every passing season. Harley, for all its thunder and history, was bleeding momentum. Honda watched patiently. They didn't need to outmuscle Harley with displacement or drown them in retro nostalgia. They simply needed to design a bike that fit the very riders Harley had overlooked. Low seat height, approachable ergonomics, manageable weight, and a price point that didn't make new riders feel like they were buying into a luxury car loan. The Rebel didn't shout for attention. It quietly solved every problem Harley refused to acknowledge. And that subtlety was its sharpest weapon. Because when riders first encountered the Rebel, there wasn't backlash. There wasn't brand confusion. There was just curiosity, followed by comfort and then by sales. People who once felt excluded by the big bike bravado of American cruisers suddenly saw themselves on two wheels again. For the first time in years, entry-level riders weren't intimidated. They were invited. This wasn't Honda trying to be better at Harley's game. This was Honda changing the game altogether. By the time Harley noticed, it wasn't just about the product anymore. It was about the cultural momentum that product had unleashed. And momentum, once it starts rolling, is harder to fight than any single competitor. The Rebel 500 wasn't loud, but it was decisive, and in its silence, it exposed just how much noise Harley had been making to cover the cracks. If you've seen one of these bikes sitting unsold near you, hit like and drop a comment. Let's expose the worst offenders together, designed for the riders left out. You shouldn't have to wrestle a cruiser to deserve one. Honda knew that. Harley never did. For decades, the American cruiser market operated on the assumption that difficulty equals prestige. High handlebars, wide stances, tall seat heights, and 550-pound frames were just part of the experience. But that experience wasn't universal. It was exclusive by design. What about riders who weren't 6 feet tall? What about women entering the market? What about those with shorter inseams, lighter frames, or simply a preference for a bike that didn't feel like wrestling a grizzly bear at every red light? Harley never had a real answer to those questions. Honda did. The Rebel 500 features a seat height of just under 28 inches. That one number told an entire story. It meant shorter riders could flat-foot the bike. It meant nervous beginners didn't have to second-guess parking angles. It meant getting on and off the bike didn't feel like scaling a mountain. Honda baked inclusivity directly into the frame geometry. But it didn't stop with ergonomics. The clutch pull is light. The controls are intuitive. The riding posture is natural. You don't lean into aggression, you settle into control. Whether you are 5 feet tall or 6 feet 3, the Rebel doesn't impose its attitude on you. It meets you where you are. That's not something Harley ever learned how to do. Their entry-level bikes, when they existed, still felt like diluted big bikes. The Rebel, it feels like a bike made for real people, living real lives, on real roads. And when these riders walked into a showroom and swung a leg over the Rebel for the first time, they weren't greeted with intimidation. They were greeted with relief. And under that sense of relief was an engine, one that didn't roar, but reassured. Need solid riding gear or tools that won't let you down? I've linked my go-to picks below, stuff I trust, not hype. Power you can trust, not tame. Not every rider wants a beast. Some want a companion, and that's what Honda built. Under the tank of the Rebel 500 sits a 471 cubic centimeter parallel twin engine. It doesn't shake the ground. It doesn't scream at traffic. But what it does is arguably more important. It earns trust. The engine makes just over 45 brake horsepower at 8,500 revolutions per minute. Torque delivery comes in the sweet spot, around 6,500 revolutions per minute. But those numbers only tell part of the story. What matters more is the feel. This engine, borrowed from Honda's CB and NX series, has earned a reputation for being bulletproof, smooth, and maintenance-friendly. It's not a power plant designed to impress you with excess. It's designed to disappear beneath you, so you focus on the ride. For a newer rider, that kind of predictability is golden. No herky-jerky throttle snatch. No overly aggressive torque that upsets balance. Just steady, usable power that makes navigating stoplights, corners, and freeway ramps feel natural. Confident, controlled. Where Harley's lower displacement engines often feel artificially thumpy and coarse, Honda's twin is a lesson in modular refinement. It knows what it is, and it doesn't pretend to be anything else. It doesn't try to replace the adrenaline rush of a sport bike or the torque mountain of a big V-twin. It exists for a different purpose entirely, to let you ride without stress. And it delivers on that promise, mile after mile, hour after hour. And Harley had a problem, the street experiment and its fallout. Back in 2014, Harley-Davidson did something bold, or at least it looked bold at the time. They released two bikes, the Street 500 and the Street 750. These were supposed to be Harley's bridge to the next generation. Slimmer, lighter, cheaper, aimed directly at urban commuters, new license holders, and younger riders who didn't grow up worshiping V-twins. On paper, it was the right move. But what they built wasn't a bridge, it was a dead end. The Street Series felt like a compromise, not a commitment. Underpowered, roughly finished, often built in India, then shipped back to the United States where it was received with a shrug. Reviewers called the ride harsh, the throttle clumsy, the fit and finish subpar, and worst of all, it lacked soul. It felt like a Harley made by committee. Dealers didn't push them. Veterans didn't respect them. Beginners didn't fall in love. And Harley retreated. Quietly, without fanfare, the company pulled the plug. The models vanished from showrooms like a chapter they wanted to forget. But riders didn't forget. Neither did analysts. Neither did Honda. Because the Street Series wasn't just a flop. It was a surrender. It told the world Harley wasn't willing to learn. It told new riders they were an experiment. Disposable. Unwelcome. Instead of refining the concept, improving the ergonomics, or investing in branding that spoke to a new era, Harley walked away. And the result was more than just a gap in the lineup. It was a void in the identity. One that Honda would fill. Not just with product, but with intention. And when they rolled out the Rebel 500, riders didn't just compare specs. They remembered. They remembered the last time Harley tried to reach them, and failed. But it wasn't just memory that made the Rebel sting. In countries like India, it was something more direct. An economic earthquake, under 6 lakh. Price as a weapon. At 6 lakh rupees, it didn't compete with Harley. It erased it. In India, 6 lakh rupees is not just a price. It's a line. A threshold where aspiration meets reality. For middle-class riders, it's the point at which a motorcycle shifts from being a dream to a decision, and Honda knew that. They priced the Rebel 500 just under that psychological floor, and in doing so, they didn't just offer a great cruiser, they triggered a seismic shift in expectations. Harley-Davidson's least expensive models in India, they hover far above that number. Even the discontinued Street Series barely approached that pricing when taxes, fees, and dealer markups were included. And for all that extra money, riders got more weight, less efficiency, fewer features, and higher maintenance costs. Meanwhile, Honda brought a global platform, LED lighting, Showa suspension, refined ergonomics, and brand trust, all at a price that felt shockingly generous. And it landed hard. Dealers reported first-time buyers walking in just to see if the price was real. Reviews flooded in comparing the Rebel to bikes twice its price. Word spread fast. Suddenly, Harley's name in India didn't represent aspiration. It represented excess, and not the good kind, the bloated kind, the overpriced kind. But the real danger wasn't what happened in India alone. It was what that price represented globally. It became a benchmark. If Honda could deliver that much cruiser for that little money, what excuse did anyone else have? In Brazil, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, riders began asking the same question. Why should we pay more for less? And Harley couldn't respond. They couldn't cut prices without cutting their own throat. They couldn't retool factories fast enough. They couldn't lean on nostalgia in countries where that nostalgia never existed. Honda didn't just win a price war, they declared it. And Harley never showed up. But while the numbers were brutal, every other cruiser brand found itself backed into a corner, with no time to prepare for what came next. Rebel versus the class. A hard recalibration. It didn't just shift the curve, it cracked it. When Honda dropped the Rebel 500 into the global mid-range cruiser space, it didn't land softly. It hit like a wrecking ball. Suddenly, every other bike in the class, from the Kawasaki Eliminator 500 to the Royal Enfield Super Meteor, looked overpriced, under-equipped, or outdated. Kawasaki had just re-entered the category with the Eliminator, priced tens of thousands of rupees above the Rebel. It had a bit more power, yes, but that marginal performance came with a less refined ride and far more intimidating styling. Buyers looking for confidence and comfort weren't swayed by spec sheets. They were won over by feel, and Honda nailed the feel. Royal Enfield's Super Meteor 650 had been making waves for its mix of affordability and presence, but the Rebel undercut it in price, beat it in tech, and outclassed it in rider friendliness. The Meteor suddenly found itself caught in the middle. Too expensive to compete with Honda, too soft to dominate Harley. Dealers noticed. Foot traffic changed. More test rides shifted toward Honda. Even brands that weren't in direct competition started recalibrating their pricing models out of fear. If Honda could redefine the value equation, everyone else had to scramble just to stay in the conversation. This wasn't a competition, it was a correction. And Harley? They weren't just overmatched, they were structurally unprepared for what followed. Because behind the glitz of pricing and the glamour of product launches, a much deeper war was brewing. One Harley never modernized for scale versus craft, why systems win. In the world of motorcycle manufacturing, what happens behind the curtain matters far more than what's parked on the showroom floor. To the untrained eye, both Honda and Harley-Davidson build motorcycles. But beneath the steel and chrome lies a brutal truth. One company is an industrial juggernaut, the other a boutique craftsman. And in an era where scale is survival, Harley is running out of time. Honda operates like a global military force, coordinated, streamlined, and always prepared to deploy. Their manufacturing model spans multiple continents, allowing them to produce the same motorcycle from Thailand to Brazil to India with the same precision and quality. This is not about cost cutting, it's about efficiency without compromise. When Honda built the Rebel 500, they didn't just design a bike, they engineered a supply chain that could feed it to the world at scale, on budget, and ahead of schedule. Harley, in contrast, builds motorcycles like it's still 1978. Small batches, domestic labor, centralized plants. Every new model is a handcrafted project rather than a modular system. That makes each Harley unique, but it also makes them expensive, slow to produce, and vulnerable to disruption. While Honda can shift production between countries to dodge tariffs or adjust to currency fluctuations, Harley remains locked in a rigid, high-cost system with almost no flex. And that's where the real horsepower gap lies. Not in torque, not in top speed, but in the cold, calculated rhythm of production. Honda shares components across models, leverages economies of scale, and negotiates bulk pricing with the confidence of a volume leader. Harley builds each bike as if it's the first time. That nostalgia comes at a cost, and in this war, it's a fatal weakness. But this isn't just a tale of two factories. It's the beginning of a much bigger unraveling, because where those bikes end up, and who actually buys them, depends on decisions Harley failed to make decades ago. And in the places where the future of motorcycling was quietly taking shape, Harley wasn't absent by accident, they were absent by choice. where the future is sold and who showed up. There was a time when Harley-Davidson flirted with global expansion. They eyed Asia, dabbled in partnerships, and whispered promises of growing beyond American roads. But in the end, they turned back. They saw the complexities, the unfamiliar landscapes, the need to adapt, and they hesitated. Meanwhile, Honda saw the exact same challenges and made a different choice. They dug in. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, these weren't just markets to Honda. They were mission-critical frontiers. For over 4 decades, Honda invested not just in dealerships, but in infrastructure, assembly plants, service networks, and community trust. They didn't arrive with an attitude. They arrived with humility, engineering, and patience. And slowly, they became the default brand across entire nations. Reliable, accessible, familiar. The brand you bought your first bike from, and maybe your last. Harley, on the other hand, never really committed. Their pricing models were imported from Milwaukee. Their styling and ergonomics were tailored to 6-foot-tall riders with open highways. Their dealer presence was limited. Their service networks thinner than a tourist map. And worst of all, they often treated these new markets as stepping stones rather than destinations. The result? Today, Harley is little more than a lifestyle logo in much of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the Honda Rebel 500 is thriving, not just as a product, but as a perfectly placed solution. It speaks the local language in fuel economy, seat height, parts availability, and financing. It is, quite simply, the right bike for places Harley never learned to understand. And when younger riders in these countries grow up, get promoted, and decide to upgrade, they stay with the brand that earned their trust from the beginning. Harley isn't just losing first-time buyers in America. They're losing lifetime customers across Asia. But while Harley faded from memory in emerging markets, something even more complicated was brewing back home, in their own dealerships. On the floor, dealers doing the math. Walk into a Harley-Davidson dealership today, and you'll feel it. The tension, the silence, the weight of unsold steel. The chrome is polished. The brochures are stacked. But the buyers? They're not walking through the doors like they used to. And behind the counters, some salespeople have started asking questions they wouldn't dare voice aloud. It's not just about inventory anymore. It's about viability. Harley's margins are shrinking. The floor models aren't moving. Financing has gotten tougher. And across town, at Honda's big wing outlets, bikes like the Rebel 500 are flying off the racks. That contrast doesn't just sting, it terrifies. More than a few Harley dealers have started looking at the math. A Rebel sells quickly. It rarely needs incentives. Its maintenance costs are low. It's attractive to new riders, urban commuters, and women. Demographics Harley struggles to reach. The Rebel brings foot traffic, repeat customers, accessory sales, upgrades, the kind of stability that keeps a dealership solvent during turbulent years. And that's when the whisper starts. Should we diversify? Should we try to get a Honda franchise? Should we quietly distance ourselves from a brand that feels stuck in reverse? It's not betrayal, it's survival. Because when you're paying rent on a showroom and praying every week for sales volume, brand loyalty doesn't keep the lights on. None of this is official. It's not on paper, but in late-night texts, in quiet bar conversations, in trade shows and regional meetings, the murmurs are growing louder. Dealers once proud to carry the Harley badge are now wondering if the future rides on a different logo. But even as the salesmen question their allegiances, a deeper unrest is stirring where the noise used to echo loudest, inside the factory walls. Inside the lines, pride, paychecks, and production. Harley's factories once hummed with purpose. There was pride in every torque wrench turn, every paint job, every ignition test. Workers in Wisconsin, Missouri, and Pennsylvania didn't just build motorcycles. They built symbols. They forged legacy out of metal. But now they're just building inventory, and everyone knows it. Morale has eroded, not because orders have stopped, but because meaning has. Workers still show up, clock in, perform their tasks. But the spark is gone. There's a silence in the break rooms, a hesitation in the handshakes, a sense that the myth of Harley-Davidson is no longer big enough to believe in, especially not when the headlines are filled with stories of the Rebel's rise. What stings more is that many of these workers have kids, and those kids are choosing Hondas. Not because they're anti-American, not because they hate Harley, but because they want bikes that fit their lives. That don't cost more than a car. That don't feel like obligations to an outdated ideal. And that realization hurts. It turns assembly into alienation. It makes each finished unit feel like a relic, not a rebellion. Some workers say they feel like they're building museum pieces now. Bikes no one asked for, at prices no one wants, with futures no one can afford to plan around. Harley's management talks about heritage, pride, tradition, but pride doesn't pay the mortgage, and tradition doesn't stop the whispers inside the factory that maybe, just maybe, the old way of doing things is finally reaching its end. And outside those walls, beyond the rumble of tools and timelines, the financial world has started to take notice. Because once the workers lose faith, the markets follow next. From moat to mirage, the market's verdict. For decades, Harley-Davidson wasn't just a motorcycle company. It was a symbol of American growth, a Wall Street darling with brand power that translated directly into shareholder confidence. But now, the tone inside investor calls is changing. Slowly, then suddenly, Harley stopped being seen as a growth story and started being viewed as a liability. The Rebel 500 didn't just shift consumer attention, it sent tremors through the stock market. Analysts once bullish on Harley-Davidson are now hedging. Hedge funds that held long positions are scaling back. And retail investors? They've already moved on. The problem isn't just competition, it's cost structure, brand fatigue, and market irrelevance. Harley's business model is built on prestige pricing. But what happens when prestige no longer moves units? Younger buyers are walking past Harley showrooms and straight into Honda's big-wing dealerships, spending less, waiting less, and walking away happier. Wall Street is doing the math. Quarterly reports show bloated inventory, stagnant margins, and aggressive discounting. Promotional costs are up, dealer incentives are up, loyalty rates down. Behind closed doors, institutional investors are asking questions they didn't dare raise 5 years ago. Questions like, can Harley lower its prices without imploding its profit structure? Can it scale without modernizing its entire supply chain? And perhaps the most uncomfortable one, can Harley still matter in a world that no longer idolizes it? Brand equity is supposed to protect a company during disruption, but when brand equity is tied to a generation that's retiring or dying, it becomes a ticking clock. Wall Street isn't emotional, it's predictive. And the prediction is clear. Harley's glory days are no longer a story of expansion. They're a case study in managed decline. But for some, the decline isn't the part that hurts. It's what the Rebel 500 revealed in the process. Because when a $13,000 Japanese bike unravels an American icon's investment narrative, it's not just a sales crisis, it's a credibility collapse. And that collapse is deeper than quarterly numbers. Because this wasn't just about performance, it was about perception. But Harley's problem wasn't the Rebel's design. It was what that design represented next. Not just a bike, a new rule book. To the untrained eye, the Honda Rebel 500 looks like just another mid-sized cruiser. Sleek, clean, stylish. But to anyone paying close attention to the evolution of two-wheeled culture, it wasn't a product. It was a pivot. This machine did more than offer a better price or easier ride. It drew a sharp line between the old idea of motorcycling and something entirely new. For over 100 years, the American cruiser narrative has revolved around chrome, thunder, and a sense of exclusionary pride. Harley-Davidson perfected that image. It sold not just bikes, but an identity, a uniform, a ritual. But the Rebel 500 didn't play by those rules. It didn't demand allegiance. It didn't ask riders to look a certain way. It simply invited them in. What Honda released wasn't design. It was a declaration. It said that the next chapter of riding would be lighter, quieter, more inclusive, and infinitely more adaptable. And riders heard it loud and clear. This wasn't rebellion for show. It was rebellion by functionality. A redefinition of what cool means in the modern era. In every detail, from its low stance and digital dash to its matte finishes and soft throttle, it communicated a new cultural code, one that prioritizes practicality over posturing, refinement over bravado. And that shift didn't just embarrass Harley, it exposed the limits of its entire cultural foundation. Symbols matter, and for decades, Harley was the symbol. But when a single product can change the emotional definition of what that symbol means, the game doesn't just change, it restarts. The Rebel 500 didn't try to compete with Harley's mythology. It replaced it with something more modern, more useful, and more emotionally honest. Because sometimes cultural revolutions don't come with banners and slogans. They come in matte black with a low seat and a quiet engine. But as this new symbol spread across Instagram feeds and city streets, Harley's boardrooms braced for a different storm, one that no algorithm could contain. Still watching? That means this stuff matters to you. Subscribe now. We're not done exposing the bikes brands don't want you to talk about. Crossroads, not checkmate. The factories are still running. The showrooms are still polished. The Milwaukee V-twin still echoes down highways on Sunday mornings. At a glance, Harley-Davidson looks alive, strong even. But beneath the chrome and the nostalgia, a harder truth is settling in. The company is standing at a crossroads, not destroyed, not yet finished, but undeniably facing a future it never wanted to confront. The arrival of Honda's Rebel 500 didn't just sting because it outsold Harley in certain markets. It hurt because it revealed something bigger, that Harley could be replaced. For decades, Harley wasn't just a motorcycle brand. It was the motorcycle brand. To ride Harley was to join a legacy, to buy into a cultural uniform that carried weight across generations. But when a single mid-sized Japanese cruiser could invite more riders, more comfortably and more affordably into motorcycling, the myth cracked. Inside dealerships, whispers grew louder. Could Honda franchises keep the lights on better than Harley's shrinking margins? On the factory floors, workers wrestled with fading pride as their own kids chose Hondas, not out of rebellion, but out of practicality. On Wall Street, investors no longer saw Harley as a growth story, but as a liability, an aging symbol losing relevance in a world that demanded adaptability. And yet, the end isn't written. Harley still has a name recognized across the globe, a design language instantly identifiable, and a loyal, if aging, core of diehards. What they lack is time. Time to re-engineer, to rebrand, to reimagine themselves before the next generation writes them out of the story completely. If Harley answers with something bold, inclusive, and globally sensible, this moment can be remembered as a turning point, a crossroads where they chose the harder but better path. But if they keep leaning on heritage without evolution, then the crossroads won't matter. Time will move on, riders will move on, and the world will forget. The Rebel didn't kill Harley-Davidson. It simply proved the unthinkable, that even an American icon could be outpaced by quiet innovation. And once that realization spreads across riders, dealers, and investors, the question won't be whether Harley can fight back. It'll be whether anyone still cares if they do. That's the story as it stands. One quiet Honda reshaping a loud segment. Your turn. Harley or Honda? Drop your pick in the comments. Whichever gets the most comments will win. If you've spotted unsold floor models or pricing misses in your area, share them below. Subscribe for the next deep dive. We're exposing the moves brands hope you don't notice. Brands hope you don't notice. Brands hope you don't notice.